The sound of dripping water echoed in the small, dank cell. A puddle had formed in the corner just behind the cracked clay chamber pot. Each drop jumped and rippled across the small pool, dusting the clay with moisture and darkening the surrounding stone. There was a quiet rhythm to it, she had discovered. At times, it comforted her. At other times, she felt herself on the brink of madness. She hadn't paid attention to the droplets. At the beginning, there had been other noises. Shouts of anger and indignation. Screams of fear and outrage. Cries of shock and disbelief. Some of these noises had been hers, back when she'd had the energy to make them. Back when she and the other captives had hoped that this would turn out to be an unfortunate and promptly rectified mistake. But the dungeons had grown quieter as the days passed and hope faded. One could only yell for so long. She thought they had talked for a time, hopefully of release and haughtily of revenge. Then they had whispered longingly of beds and meals and hearths, fearfully of the violence of the people. There had been murmurs eventually unintelligible and delirious with hunger, dehydration, and pain, then just hoarse, ragged breaths. And as the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, even those had given way to silence and the slow tip-tap of the water, trickling down from some place far removed from this hell. She was the last one. She was not sure how she still lived, but she was certain it would not be for much longer. Few of her compatriots had expired in the squalor of their cells. Most had been dragged away still breathing and none had returned. She could not remember the name of the first man they had taken. Perhaps she had known him once, curtsied before him at a ball or a tea party, but now she remembered only his voice. When they came for him, he had bellowed at the guards with such an air of command that for a moment, they had moved to obey. They had beat him for it, as if to remind him that he was now powerless, as if to remind themselves. She had not seen it, but she had heard it. What occurred out of view of one's eyes, she had learned, was far more terrifying than what one could see. The heavy, thudding blows of their batons, the grunting, the shouting, the pleading, the sound of splattering and a terrible crack. They had hauled him past her cell afterward, bloody and barely upright, with his arm curled against his body, limp and twisted. She had never seen tears on a grown man's face before. His eyes had met hers for a moment, and a flicker of recognition had crossed his crumpled face, which, he had spat at her, blood speckling his lips. Yes, perhaps she had known him once. None had called her by her name since she'd been brought to this place. Well, few had called her by her name even before that. How she longed for that simple piece of humanity, that small but essential identity that she had so readily given away 10 years ago. Her name was Etta, but the man who had interrogated her all those months ago had christened her Blood Witch. He had shaved her teeth down himself so that she could not feed, and though his fingers had been careful, gentle even, he had not believed her words when she spoke the truth. But perhaps she herself was unsure of what the truth was. She only knew that she was Etta. Did not matter now. Maybe it never had, because she was the last one. When would they come for her? That was all there was left for her to think about. Perhaps she would be beaten also, perhaps raped or humiliated. There would certainly be a trial, however farcical, but perhaps it would be warm in that chamber. Perhaps she would feel warmth for a moment. The execution would certainly take place outdoors for the people to witness, she knew. She hoped it would be a clear day, with a strong breeze. She hoped she would see the sun and the sky and feel the wind on her face before they put the hood over her head. She found herself fantasizing about it as she lay motionless on her bed of dirty straw, just a pace away from the chamber pot and the dripping water. The seasons had changed because she could now feel the cold of the stone beneath her and beside her. It seeped into her bones, causing them to ache and ache. There was no comfort any longer. She had thought the same the very day they had locked her in here, but she hadn't understood then. One did not understand discomfort until the cushion of one's own flesh melted away from hunger, until hunger itself faded away into an agonizing, unrelenting void beneath one's breast. Her skin felt taut and tight across her bones. She was little more than that in truth, and so the very essence of her scraped and ground against the filthy straw and stone. The steady tip-tap that so titillated her, so taunted her, was her only reliable source of nourishment in this place. Sometimes, not often enough, a sneering guard would throw a stub of hard bread into her cell. A few times, a handful of cold gruel or spoiled milk had been poured directly into her outstretched hands, accompanied by laughter as she frantically slurped and licked it up. She had even eaten a good deal of the straw that had initially lined the cell, hoping it would at some point be replenished. It hadn't, but at least in her few moments of lucidity, she could crawl over to the chamber pot, which hadn't been filled or emptied in her recent memory, and moisten her sandy mouth with the slow stream of dripping water. A series of loud thuds and clangs, followed by the sound of well-ordered footsteps, interrupted her reverie. The noises felt distant, almost dreamlike, and it took her a moment to register that the heavy iron door at the end of the hall had been opened, and the guards were approaching. Briefly she thought of food, but almost immediately she knew otherwise. Too many footsteps approached. They were too confident, too disciplined. Unexpectedly she felt a booming in her chest. Her entire body convulsed and began to tremble, as if a bucket of icy water had been tossed over her head. She lurched and struggled into a seated position just in time to see the guards. No, not just guards, but soldiers, come to a stop before her cell. Momentarily blinded by the brightness of the lamp they carried, she could barely get a breath in between the shivers that racked her. Fear. For some reason, she had not imagined the fear she would feel in this moment. As her vision cleared, words bubbled up in her throat, choking her as they failed to pass her chattering teeth. Desperate words, pleading words. She had not imagined these, either. Despite her gurgling, the men were silent as their leader unbarred the gate to her cell. They watched him warily, all but ignoring her, and she came to understand why as the gate swung open, its hinges creaking with disuse. It had been over a decade since she had last laid eyes on him, but she was certain it was him. His face was deeply shadowed in the flickering light of the single lamp. He was not the young man she remembered. Gray streaked his temples and lines of his face were sharper, colder. But surely, he too would see it was her. Surely he would understand that none of this was her fault. "Brother, please," she managed to croak, willing, begging that he would know her. In the next moment her ears were ringing, her head and the side of her face hot with pain, and as the stars cleared from her eyes, she realized she was staring directly at a pair of well-polished boots. It took her several pain-filled moments to realize that he had hit her, and she had fallen onto her side. "I would kill you," he said, his voice shaking with rage, "if not for the hundreds waiting to see you die." It was in the loss of this final hope that she dared to look up at him. Their eyes met and her trembling stilled. So profound was the terror that gripped her. No recognition crossed his features. Instead, pure hatred shone behind his sunken eyes. She felt herself recoil deeper into the corner of the cell, pressing herself against the stone as though hoping it would swallow her. "Bring the witch," he commanded, exiting the cell without a backward glance. Two men entered in his place. She felt no shame at the obvious disgust in their expressions as they each grabbed an arm, roughly hauling her to her knees and then to her feet. It was quickly discovered that she could not stand or walk on her own. Whether this was due to the heavy blow she had just taken, the long captivity that had come before it, or simply the pure terror that gripped her, Etta could not be sure. She was only barely aware of the skin on the tops of her feet rubbing off as the men dragged her from her cell and then down the long hallway they had come from. They led her through the door at the end of the hallway into another long hallway, closing behind them the heavy iron door whose opening and closing she had listened for with hope and dread, and hope and dread and dread and dread. The finality of the thunk as it swung shut, and the clang as the bar was slipped into place over it triggered her shivering anew. It would be the last time, and she knew it with finality. She did not remember much of the journey out of the dungeon itself. It might have taken hours or only a few minutes. She hung between the two men like a doll, limp and motionless but for her tremors. For their part, they carried their burden silently. Their leader walked quickly and wordlessly at the head of the group, never looking back at the woman who had called him brother. A few men, guards, greeted them curtly as they reached the well-lit guardroom. The brightness stung Etta's eye. Only one eye, she realized, as the other had swollen shut. She did not look up to see who the guards were, nor did she listen closely to what words were exchanged between the two groups. Their business was swiftly conducted, and they exited the room through a monstrous set of iron and stone doors. It took 3 men to open but one side of it. At last, Etta turned her face upward to the gray winter's day. She could not see the sun, but a cold, crisp wind blew, biting her skin. Her raw, bleeding feet now scraped along the cobblestone as the men dragged her along, but she did not care. She heard sobbing and realized that it came from her. It was not like she had imagined, but it was better, she was sure of it. Now if only there might be a moment of warmth. An uncovered carriage awaited them not far from the doors. The men dropped her and she fell unceremoniously to her knees before it. One of them bound her hands tightly together with a length of rope, a formality, as she was sure they all knew. Even if she had not been emaciated, she was too scared to fight. Instead, she continued to weep miserably, breathing in as much of the fresh air as she could manage through her open mouth. She had discovered she could not close it without great pain, and so she no longer tried to. She was lifted and thrown onto the floor of the carriage, and she lay there, exhausted and terrified as the soldiers climbed in and settled on the benches around her. After a momentary pause, the carriage began to move. She found herself staring at a pair of boots again, but she was not sure who they belonged to. She did not try to look for or speak to her brother again. If the men spoke, she did not listen. The carriage rocked and jostled her, reminding her of every bruise on her body, and the cold wind she had been so grateful for began to cut and slice through her. And yet somehow the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves, so like the tip-tap she had grown used to, lulled her into a kind of slumber. It was not peaceful or restful, and she was certain that she was terrified the entire time. But for a while she slept. When she awoke, it was to the rumble of a storm. Or, at least, that is what it sounded like to her at first. Like the roar of distant thunder, growing closer and closer. Like winds howling through the trees. Like torrential rains, beating against cobblestone. The sheer force of its anger stunned her into wakefulness, and her fear paralyzed her once more. As the carriage proceeded, slowing down now, she began to pick out voices in the storm, and she realized that she heard not the wrath of the mother of creation, but the wrath of her child, of man. The people had come for her, and their violence shook the wagon. The soldiers around her began to shout commands. They stood brandishing batons and threatening violence. At some point earlier they must have been joined by other soldiers on horseback or on foot, because a chorus of male voices joined together to quell the crowd that thronged up around the wagon. At last the wagon came to a stop. There was a commotion, and Etta could hear shouts of "hold" and "peace," and with great effort, the will held the people at bay. She did not struggle as she was manhandled out of the wagon and strung up once more between two soldiers. Fear held her still as a corpse. At the sight of her, a primal chant rose up from the crowd calling for the witch to be burned. This was not a trial, she realized. There would be no trial. This was her execution. She was carried up onto a large elevated stage. No doubt, it had been constructed in the middle of the town square specifically for this spectacle. She had seen executions before, had stood an anonymous witness among many, horrified and fascinated in the square as some cutpurse was hanged. Now, she dared glanced out across the crowd, a massive crowd unlike one she had ever seen before, and saw not one human being. Instead, countless faces white with rage and accusing eyes, black with bloodlust. There was no humanity here, and there would be no mercy. She was thrown to her knees, and she crumpled immediately, unable to hold herself up. To the cheers of the crowd, a soldier grabbed her by the hair and yanked her into a kneeling position, directing her gaze upward even as her neck and scalp screamed with protest. She was too frightened, too weak to even raise her hand to her head. Instead, she looked with her one good eye directly into the face of the man who had interrogated her at the beginning of it all. The man who had taken her name and made her a witch. Whereas the wind now seemed to buffet her, it only smoothed his flaxen hair away from his face. He did not look at her with cruelty. There was no murderous intent on his face, but his expression was resolute, as hard as granite. Her body began to shake, the fear sharp and fresh once more. This man would be the one to kill her, and he would not lose a moment's rest over it. He turned from her, and with just that gesture those gathered quieted. Whereas the soldiers had yelled and postured to control the crowd, he needed only direct his attention toward them. Such was his presence. They waited expectantly, hungrily, for him to begin. For the crimes of witchcraft, murder of kin and ward, carnal and unnatural depravity, and the subversion of the natural order, I hereby sentence the blood witch Elizabeth Bathory to be burned at the stake. His voice resounded clearly through the square, and a crescendo of cheers shook the stage. With a motion of his hands, he quieted the onlookers once more. In my power as Count of Ext and Marquis of Heves, I will it be so. The man's words echoed in her head, drowning out the animalistic applause that followed. Burned. He would be burned. No, that was not what she had imagined. The soldiers who had carried her to the stage sprang into action. She had not noticed, so narrowed was her attention on the man before her, the pyre on which she would die. In the center of the stage, a large metal basin sat forebodingly, filled with wood and with a thick metal pole rising from the center. As the men approached her, words spilled from her lips, barely audible even to her own ears. Please, 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 she found herself stammering. Spare me, I beg you. Spare me this. She repeated the words like a mantra, but the men paid her no heed. She writhed, struggling against the rope that bound her hands, but the men easily overpowered her, lifting her into the basin and fastening her to the pole. Before they reached her legs, she began to flail and kick, sending wooden chips and sticks flying, but they paid her no mind. One of the men easily grasped her legs together, wrapping them in rope and then tying them to the pole as well. The other efficiently returned the fallen wood to the basin. Her dress was wet as the men stepped back, but she did not feel shame at having urinated on herself. She felt nothing but terror, hot terror, cold terror, a terror so single-minded, so depraved, that she was sure she had lost her mind. With a horrible start, she realized that her brother stood nearby, one of a line of soldiers waiting stiffly on the stage, and in a final desperate moment she screamed to him, "Brother, Ivar, please." He started toward her, his face distorted like that of a demon's, knuckles white as they clenched to draw the sword at his hip. The interrogator, that Count of Ext and Marquis of Heves, whoever he was, stepped forward with an outstretched hand, halting the impending violence wordlessly. Ivar stepped back into position, but in his eyes already burned the fire that would soon consume her. She whimpered and grunted, screamed when she had the energy. She was conscious of little outside of her panic. She had thought she would be hung. A man stepped forward holding a bucket, and began to dump brownish liquid into the basin, coating the wood and splashing it over her legs and feet. She had thought she would be hung and that they would cover her head, that the hood would conceal not only her face, but her fear from everyone present, from even herself. This was not what she had imagined. He was crying. This was not what she had imagined at all. Now another man stepped forward and handed a lit torch to the Count of Exton, Marquis of Heves, that man who had interrogated her, that man who had condemned her to burn, and who intended to set her alight with his own hands. He walked toward her, holding the torch in front of him, and met her eyes. His eyes were a clear blue, the color of the sky she had wished to see. "I am Etta Belton of Hesse," she cried, and the wind seemed to carry her voice farther than it had any of her screams. He did not flinch. If he felt anything by her words, neither his face nor eyes betrayed him. He threw the torch into the basin. The flames sprung up immediately, spreading wildly across the pyre, spurred by the foul oil that had been poured upon it. They curled and licked at her feet and legs like grasping fingers, and quickly they caught her, igniting the oil that had splattered on her body. There might have been a moment of warmth before the searing agony began, but it was not the moment of warmth she had imagined. She thrashed, straining with more strength than she thought she had left. Her body contorted against her bindings in ways she hadn't thought possible, but her skin burned nonetheless, a smell of cooking, blackening meat filling her nostrils along with the smoke that rose up around her feet. The pole she had been fastened to heated, and long before the flames climbed her body, her back and hair began to burn, melting onto the hot metal. At some point before the smoke blinded her, she looked out across the crowd, searching as though on instinct. There, standing triumphantly with the other soldiers, was her brother Ivar. But it was not him she sought. She swung her head madly, from devil to devil. They watched her burn with pleasure and disgust, unable to look away from the revenge they had so frantically desired. There, one among the many, one face she knew, one face she loved, the only face that recognized her for who she was. Her sister's angelic face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were wet with determination. "Sister," Etta murmured as she felt her vision begin to darken. "Sister," Franca mouthed, holding Etta's gaze until she saw no more. "I will save you," Etta heard, and then she neither heard nor felt any more. With a gasp, Etta's eyes opened. Her entire body jerked, as one does when waking suddenly from a dream. Her hands scrambled for purchase, and she clawed the surfaces they met, clutching them with force enough to break her nails. Eyes rolling in a frenzy from side to side, she saw nothing for several excruciating moments. There were other sounds maybe, but all were muffled except for that tip-tap and the frantic sound of her breathing. Where was she? Blood and bloody bones. Where was she? Panic gripped her like a vice. The fire. By the mother of all things, it had been so hot. Was she burning? Was she still burning? A strangled cry escaped her lips, and she flailed wildly, comprehending nothing. "Miss Etta," a soft, concerned voice queried. A small hand seemed to appear out of nowhere, and then it clasped her knee, and suddenly she could feel it. Not the melting of her skin, not the searing of her flesh. Reality converged around that gentle voice, that firm touch. She was sitting, not tied to a scorching metal pole, not even curled up on a paltry bed of straw, but properly seated upon a cushioned bench. She was not in pain. Her vision was blurry, but she blinked away tears, and her eyes focused on the woman across from her, whose hand on her knee seemed to anchor her to the present. They were in a small lit compartment. Above her, she could see neither a smoke-filled winter's sky nor rough gray stone, instead a rich wooden ceiling. And yet the sound still tormented her. Panting, she swung her head around in search of its source. Throwing herself toward the heavy drapes on one side of the compartment, she yanked them apart. A window, and outside of it, a gigantic black crow perched on the frame, its single red eye staring straight at her. Beyond that, the mid-evening dusk framed bare branch trees as they passed the window one after the other. "Mother and maiden," the woman exclaimed, momentarily distracted from her concern over Etta's stricken behavior. She flapped her hands at the window hastily, intent on driving the bird off. But the colossal thing was undeterred, twitching its head this way and that as it maintained its steady red-eyed glare. "It's brought you a black dream, it has. The blasted thing." They were in a moving carriage, Etta realized. As if to punctuate her realization, a bump in the road lifted her ever so slightly off her seat, and she made out the telltale clip-clop of laboring horses. The plump, middle-aged woman across from her was her maid Marta, who had tended her for as long as she could remember. This was no execution. This was no prison. Her breathing calmed a bit, but her hands remained fisted in the thick drapes. Her knuckles were white, her fingers cold. "Where is this?" Etta managed, her voice shaking. Something was dawning on her, some sickening realization. Marta left off her attempts at frightening the crow away, redirecting her attention toward Etta with brows drawn in sympathy. "My poor dear," she said, reaching forward to grasp one of Etta's hands warmly. "Not to worry, Miss Etta. We're very nearly at Cactus Castle. Should be there before full dark." Etta could feel the blood drain from her face. A wave of lightheadedness, of nausea, of pure dread washed over her. No, no, no. Not there. Not where it had all started. The crow wrapped its beak against the window again, looking steadily at Etta, as if it knew, as if it was reminding her. It had been her arrival at Cactus Castle all those years ago that had triggered her torturous wait for death, with only the tip-tap of leaking water to keep her company. It had been the events that had taken place at Cactus Castle over the last decade that had steered her, inevitably and obliviously, to her agonizing demise. And the bird knew, so it reminded her. Stop the carriage, Etta said quietly. Her head spun. Her stomach surged. She could not return to Cactus Castle. The bird blinked its bloody eye and launched itself off the windowsill with a solid thunk, disappearing into the darkening forest. Stop the carriage, Etta managed, lurching forward with her hands over her mouth, barely in time to prevent herself from spewing the contents of her stomach all over the upholstered seating. Swearing prolifically for a woman of such sweet temperament, Marta knocked twice, loud and hard, against the wall behind her. There was a shout and then another, and within moments the carriage began to slow. Etta did not wait for it to come to a stop. A hand still clapped over her mouth. She wrenched open the carriage door, stumbling through the threshold and falling the rest of the way to the road below. She rolled, catching herself on wrists and knees. A shooting pain ran up her left arm and it gave way as her body began to empty in waves of bitter retching. Looking up from where she lay in her own ill, she saw the crow perched nearby, its red eyes trained on her expectantly. It watched her because it knew she could not return to Cactus Castle. She would not. Pushing herself up with her good hand, she was cognizant that the carriage had finally come to a stop some ways off. Marta was calling for her, joined by two male voices, but it was not to them she went. She pitched herself into the forest, through tangled branches and thorny briar that pulled and shredded her soiled dress. The shadows were deep and she could see little, but she did not care. Anywhere but Cactus Castle. Loud, flapping wings alerted her to the crow, just in time for her to duck as it swooped down to grab at her hair. Its talons grazed her scalp, not hard enough to draw blood, but enough to startle her out of her panicked run. The animal landed on a low branch in front of her, and fixed her with its shining ruby eye. It was the largest crow she had ever seen. Its silky black feathers shone, iridescent even in the dim evening light, and its eyes, those eyes would not let her escape. She stood before it, gasping and wild-eyed, like a criminal awaiting a brutal judgment, like the criminal she already was. No, she whispered, please no. It cocked its head, still holding her gaze, and then it spoke in a voice that was almost beyond comprehension. The tragedy has already begun. Etta fell to her knees before the crow, her heart thundering in her chest. Why not a talking crow? Why in the hell's not a bloody talking crow? A part of her had already realized it the moment she had recognized Marta. Her memory of her trip to Countess Elizabeth Bathory's castle more than 10 years ago had faded to a vague outline in her mind. It was not an event she often revisited, but one did not need more than an outline to paint the full picture when one had been thrust directly into the canvas. Marta was dead. She had died almost a decade ago, not long after their arrival at Cactus Castle. But she had been alive in the carriage just now, just as she had been when they'd first made this journey, and her hands had been warm. I cannot return, Etta pleaded. I do not understand, but I cannot return to that place. Then you will die in the forest. There was no emotion in the words. The crow stated a simple fact. Choose. So she could choose this time. There had been no choice during her first journey. Stupid, foolish Etta had made few choices for herself back then. Her father had chosen to accept the invitation to Countess Bathory's gymnasium on her behalf. And stupid, foolish Etta had been excited for it. She had chattered to Marta the entire way from alternately spouting silly fantasies about what it would be like to escape her overbearing father and brothers with tearful regrets about leaving behind her beloved younger sister. But this time she could choose. I do not wish to die, Etta said. Not in this forest now, and not on the pyre either. The crow cocked its head as though curious. Then you must return to Cactus Castle and change your fate with your own hands. A thrill ran through Etta's entire body. Change her fate, with her own hands. Could she do such a thing? Was it really possible? To avoid the inevitable? To change a future she had already witnessed? She gulped. But how? I still don't understand what's happening. The crow's glassy red eye betrayed nothing despite the noise it made. It took Etta a moment to realize that it was laughing. You understand. Already the future has changed. The bird fluffed its feathers, then extended its wings. A spike of panic pierced her as she understood that it readied itself for flight. Wait, please explain to me what is happening. Tell me what to do. She stumbled forward to her feet, grabbing at the crow as it launched itself into the air. Please. She stepped back again, craning her neck to watch as it circled once, twice overhead just out of her reach. Please, she pleaded, but the crow continued to ascend into the sky. Already the future has changed. If you wish to change it further, you must listen to the whispers. You must choose when to be seen. Please, Etta screamed, but the crow was already out of sight, lost to the inky sky. She did not know how long she stood there, her neck straining backward as she stared up at the sky the crow had vanished into. But that was how she stayed until the already faltering dusk faded, and the overcast sky turned truly black. By then, her ragged breaths had slowed and her wet cheeks had dried stiff and cold. Her dress, though of a sturdy thick wool for traveling, had been torn in various places, and the chill of early spring began to creep in. She did not want to go to Cactus Castle. The very thought of it inspired a fear in her so primal that it took all her effort not to take off running again. to run so long and far that her lungs burst and her feet bled, and she could not find her way back even if she changed her mind. But she did not want to die either, and it was this equally frightening prospect that kept her standing where the crow had left her. It had told her, but she still could not. And that was where she was when her brother, Ivar, came upon her. She had heard him calling for her by then, shouting her name and scrambling urgently through the dense undergrowth somewhere behind her. But despite the lantern he carried, the thickness of the forest and her utter stillness had concealed her from him until he was almost directly upon her. He erupted into the small clearing where she stood with such abruptness that he almost dropped his only source of light and hope of finding their way back to the road. Panting with surprise, relief, and not a little anger, he grabbed her by the shoulder, spinning her around to face him and shaking her with barely constrained violence. "Have you lost your bloody mind?" he boomed, breath hot between them. His normally stern face was twisted with rage, but it was quickly rearranged when he noticed her pale face and felt her quaking beneath his hand. He looked her up and down, trying to locate the source of her disquiet. "What on mother's blessed earth has happened, Etta?" he implored, his voice quieter but still fraught with emotion. His hand was firm, bruising on her shoulder. A trickle of cold fear made its way down her spine at the sight of him. She could not help but recall the brute force with which he had struck her back in her cell, or the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as she had been consumed on the pyre. It had not been so long ago for her, though perhaps for him it was far in the future. He was her brother and he knew her, and because of that he would not hurt her. Not right now. She gulped, willing herself to speak but could not find her words. "Speak, Etta," he urged, squeezing her shoulder as though to spur her on. She could only recoil, shaking her head and averting her eyes. "Bloody, rotting bones," he swore as it became clear that she would remain silent. He released his hold on her shoulder to grab her hand and, lantern aloft, he began to lead them back in the direction of the road. Etta went with him, offering little resistance despite her trepidation. But just as she always had, she let someone else make the choice for her. After what felt like an hour of carefully picking their way through the interlocking branches, they began to make out the panicked voices of Marta and the hired coachman, and a faint glow of light could be seen off in the distance. They had found their way back, though Etta would not have cared either way. "I have her," Ivar called forward, and Etta could hear Marta's loud exclamation of relief. Under the bright pool of light that spilled out onto the road from the lantern-lit carriage, the full extent of Etta's physical state became apparent, to say nothing of her mental situation, as she remained silent and trembling. She was covered in vomit, and her clothing was in tatters. She had numerous bruises and scratches from her fall and subsequent flight through the woods, including several on her face that concerned Marta greatly. But worst of all was her wrist, which had now become quite club-like in appearance, distended and purple with swelling. "It's broken, I just know it," Marta wailed. "It'll never be right again." They had helped her back into the carriage where she and Marta now sat. The door was open and Ivar and the coachman stood just outside in tense conversation, wary of Etta's poor constitution. Marta fussed over her, wiping bloody scratches with a damp handkerchief and demanding that she keep her left hand elevated on the backrest of the bench. For her part, Etta felt little pain. The panic, the terror, the sheer impossibility of her situation had given way to a resigned exhaustion. She almost laughed. She had never had any choice in this. "We'll not make it to the castle, sir," the coachman explained. "Not in good time, and not in the dead of night like this." "Blood and blasted maiden," Ivar swore repeatedly, beginning to pace back and forth in a tight circle. His thick, dark hair was in disarray from the evening's exertions, and he ran his hands through it restlessly. He had donned his Navy soldier's uniform for their arrival at Cactus Castle this evening, but it now looked rumpled and scuffed. He was not a man who tolerated disorder in himself, and the unusualness of his behavior roused Etta just slightly from her stupor. He glanced into the carriage, eyes resting on her swollen hand. "My sister needs a healer tonight. We could make for X village," the coachman offered. "It is well on our route and closer." "Then let us make for the village," Marta interrupted shrilly, sticking her head out the open door. "And in and quickly. Miss Etta must be tended to and she must rest." For a moment, Ivar looked like he might protest Marta's intrusion. Instead, he shook his head and halted his pacing, his mind obviously set. "To X, yes. Let us make us haste." Presently, the carriage door was fastened shut, and they lurched into motion once more. Ivar had returned to the front with the coachman, and Etta was left with a stricken Marta. The older woman chewed her lip with worry, clutching at her skirts and cursing the road for every bump and roll. She hardly took her eyes off her injured ward, but she did not ask questions, and for that Etta was grateful. "That bloody blackened beast of a crow," Marta muttered, content to lay the blame elsewhere. The carriage jostled along to its new destination as the night deepened around them. Etta's mind felt numb and foggy. She did not want to think about what was happening. It was almost too much to grasp. In what she perceived to be no more than a day, she had gone from a barely living prisoner to a witch burned alive, and now, she had gone back to the beginning of it all. Had everything been a dream? Were her memories of the last decade, of the last year, of her last day just some sort of horribly lucid black dream? Even if they were, was she willing to risk her life by ignoring them? Already the future has changed. Indeed, things were unfolding differently from what she remembered. For one, there had been no mad foray into the forest or talking crow before. The carriage had had no reason to stop in her memories. For another, she knew for a fact that they had arrived at Cactus Castle this night, been welcomed by the steward and served a small nighttime meal alongside another group of late arrivals. She had retired to bed well past midnight, but in her own private room, her first time sleeping without Franca and Marta in the same chamber. And tomorrow she would have woken in those finely outfitted quarters, far too luxurious for one of her standing, completely oblivious to the way she would be lured, over the course of the days and months and years that followed, to her death. But this time they would stop over in the village of Ext. No doubt, with the perturbed state of their party, they would stay the night. Perhaps they would not even leave for the castle until after the midday meal. That gave her something she had not had before: time. And with time, perhaps she could find a way to escape. Etta was still churning over this possibility when they arrived in Ext at the village inn. Accommodations were hastily made by her brother, rooms arranged, luggage unloaded, and horses seen to. A runner, a bleary-eyed boy of no more than 12, was sent by the innkeeper, himself in his nightclothes, to fetch the healer, and Etta was all but carried by Marta and Ivar out of the carriage and into the room she would share with the older woman. Ivar was ushered out, and Marta began her work. First she peeled Etta out of her ruined dress, gingerly navigating the offended wrist. Then, with a bowl of hot water provided by the innkeeper's wife and a clean towel, Marta wiped her from head to toe, clearing off dirt and twigs and blood. A nightdress was donned and Etta's hair, mussed from her flight despite having been braided and pinned, was released, brushed, and plaited. Marta left as soon as Etta had settled into bed, mistrustful of the innkeeper to not be abed by the time the healer arrived. Finally, Etta was alone. A single candle burned on the table beside the bed, but it was enough to illuminate most of the small room. There were two beds very close together, a washing stand with a pitcher of water and a discreetly placed chamber pot, and just enough room to store the trunks they had brought with them from Hesse. In the quiet of the room, she could almost imagine that it had all been a black dream. Her arm had begun to throb sharply, but the pain only highlighted all the other sensations she had not experienced in so long. She had grown up with far better furnishings, but the bed on which she lay felt softer than any she had ever lain on before. The linens were the smoothest she had ever felt, and the candlelight so gentle. Tears slid from her eyes. Was this what comfort had felt like? Thud, thud, thud. Her heart jumped to her throat at the sound of approaching footsteps. Panic almost set in, but these footsteps were not the heavy ones of iron-toed boots on hard stone. They were softer and quieter, leather soles on creaking wood. The door swung open. It was Marta, her face decidedly displeased, followed by a bent old woman with Ivar in the rear. The young boy who had run to fetch the healer stepped into the room for a moment, dropping a heavy satchel near the door with little decorum, before ducking out and pulling the door shut behind him. The small room felt cramped with all four of them present, but neither Marta nor Ivar seemed willing to step out. "Miss Belton, I presume," the old woman stated, in a voice that seemed far too strong for her bony frame and wispy gray hair. She approached the bed without hesitation. "Sit up now and let me have a look." It took Etta a moment to arrange herself into a seated position. The old woman extended a wrinkled hand to assist her, which she did with a surprising amount of strength, and then ensured that a pillow was in place for Etta to lean back on. Any words Etta might have said were promptly silenced as the woman grabbed her chin. Her head was turned this way and that, and a set of spry fingers worked along her jaw as though tracing the shape of her teeth. The woman leaned forward, coming uncomfortably close. It was only then that Etta noticed the milky film covering both of her eyes. She blinked in astonishment, and the woman shot her a largely toothless smile. "Not to worry, dearie. The eyes have gone, but I still see just fine." In a quieter voice, loud enough for only Etta's ears, the old crone added, "See enough to smell the blood and smoke on you." Etta felt her face drain of color, but the woman had moved on now to looking at Etta's wrist. She grasped it firmly, and despite her shock at the woman's words, Etta yelped in pain. "Now just what are you doing?" Marta screeched, stepping forward only for Ivar to place a firm, warning hand on her shoulder. The plump maid bristled with outrage, but did not continue her tirade beyond several quietly indignant statements that sounded suspiciously like "blind as bat and a worm," which were ignored by all present. Etta, in particular, was still reeling from the woman's earlier words. "She'll live, despite Mistress Joseph's fears," the old woman said after some minutes. Marta huffed audibly with annoyance at the woman's jab. "The wrist is not broken, but well and truly twisted. I'll set it so that she stays off it and give a salve for the swelling. Best avoid it for a fortnight or so." The woman gestured without looking to the satchel that had been dropped near the doorway, and Ivar promptly fetched it for her. She rummaged around in it, first setting a tab of folded wax paper on the nearby table. The salve, she affirmed, and then laying strips of linen onto the bed beside Etta. Ivar hovered behind her for a moment before returning to his place beside the door. And what of her? Ivar wavered, hysterics. The old healer turned to face him, that same gummy smile on her leathery face. I'll have to agree with Mistress Joseph's diagnosis. A black dream most like. I've some sleeping powder I'll leave with you. She'll be out like a doused fire with just a sprinkle of it, and after a night or two of sleep she'll be back to rights. Another tab of folded wax paper appeared, this one slightly smaller, and was set beside the other one on the table. The woman worked quietly under the watchful gaze of Marta and Ivar. Despite her earlier roughness, her touch was remarkably gentle as she first applied the strongly herbal salve onto Etta's wrist and forearm, and then fashioned a neat splint from a few smooth sticks and a length or two of cloth. Etta watched in silence, her initial surprise at the woman's words replaced with disbelief. She must have imagined it. There was no other explanation. Finally, the healer carefully unwrapped the second parcel of wax paper. Nimbly, she pinched off some of the white powder within and, squeezing Etta's lips open with her other hand, peppered it onto her tongue. She was lowered onto the bed and within moments, a wave of drowsiness washed over her. Distantly, she knew the room's 3 remaining occupants conversed for a time. As though through a deep haze, she perceived the opening and closing of the door as Ivar and the healer departed. So fast and hard, indeed, did sleep tighten its grip on her that she felt a prickle of fear at what it would bring with it. She tried to fight it off, struggling to keep her eyes open, to move her limbs, to make a sound. But it was no use. With every blink and breath, her body grew leaden. Only her chest rose, slow and deep, as she was overtaken. Her last thought lingered, an image of the old healer and her milky, knowing eyes, an echo of her words and the faint scent of blood and smoke. Etta woke slowly as though floating up from a great depth. She was conscious, first, of light behind her eyelids and the distant, muffled sounds of day, voices, clinking cutlery, clanging pots, a chair being pushed back from a table. Beyond even that, the creaking of wagons and the barking of a dog. She was warm, cocooned in soft linens. Sleep was loath to release her from its bind, but she found herself equally reluctant to go. She did not move or open her eyes. Would it all disappear at the first sign of her wakefulness? Would she find herself, once more, in the dungeon beneath Cactus Castle?